O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the relationship between surprise, error, grace, virtue, beauty, which came up in the net 111, which I appreciate everyone was there who made it possible. And it was really an example that Thomas Jockin gave that helps make the point. Is imagine you were going to give a presentation at a college, and you get there, and it turns out they overbooked the auditorium and actually, or, they forgot the presentation was going on. So you're forced to move to a bar, and when you get to the bar, you find it's alive, that actually it's not cleared out, there's lots of people still there drinking, and you're like, oh my goodness, and you still have to give this presentation. Right there would actually be rational, and you would be completely justified to be upset, or, to be upset at the administration, at the college for messing everything up. You would also be justified if you gave a bad presentation. It wouldn't be your fault, right? I mean, the circumstances are against you. But if you actually had the capacity to rise to the occasion and give an excellent presentation, maybe because you know your subject so well, you're also trained in voice projection, that would create quite a beautiful experience. It would create something memorable, and it would also be an opportunity for you to show capacity without showing off capacity. Furthermore, if you have this capacity, you could walk in and kind of self-forget. You wouldn't think about, it wouldn't even occur to you, as Jockin was saying, to blame the auditorium or be upset at the university because, you have the capacity to rise to the occasion. And what's very interesting about thinking all of this together, this surprise, is there are various tensions in philosophy that sometimes can be difficult to square. Like, what does it mean to do something for its own sake? How do you have virtue and it not be a medal where you're showing off your virtue? What is beauty? What is the strike of beauty versus the aesthetic of beauty? In what circumstances being come forth, almost in a Heidegger sense, There are all these tensions in philosophy, and I think more and more at the net and on the liminal web, I think of Alex Ebert's work with the encounter of the limit, his emphasis on the suboptimal. We've talked at the net about encounterology. Jockin, teaching on beauty, has talked about the strike of beauty, and I've spoken with Matthew Allison about surprise and mystery versus meta. And I think more and more that the circumstance that philosophy and theology, I would say as well, needs to really focus at in orbit in order to think itself well is the surprise, is the error. Thomas Wynne on Heidegger was saying in a funny way that to be shepherds of being is to shepherd error and to see grace in the error, because the error allows you to let be something that otherwise you couldn't let be without the ego getting in the way, which would be to confuse being with a being, if you will. What I mean by all this is that you can't will a surprise. Like, a surprise has to happen without you knowing about it. If you will a surprise, it's not surprising, right? And how does a surprise occur? Well, it just has to happen. It's outside of your control. So right there, you could almost think of providence in theology, something that, you can't really will, but once it occurs, you could respond to it. It calls you in a way. And by definition, rationality and technology and efficiency would be all about avoiding error. You can't intentionally will an error. Now, you might, increase the probability of encountering surprise and error, but you can't will it. Otherwise, it's not the same. It's just self-destruction. And honestly, perhaps our need for error to show virtue and to experience beauty, if you will, is what self-destruction is after subconsciously but can't make for itself. So perhaps self-destruction and the need for error tied together. But let me explain. So, surprise and error, and also like Matthew Allison and I were talking about on how natural law is what makes it possible for there to be surprise in nature. Like, you need the regularity of gravity so that the miraculous could occur. So the point of law is not to keep out miracle, but, natural law or natural habit in a Humean sense. The point is that without regularity, you couldn't recognize the surprise or the miracle. It couldn't be meaningful to you. So you need that regularity for the possibility of surprise, and thus mystery, thus beauty, thus strikes, and so on and so forth. But so error and surprise is outside of your control. But what is in your control is how you respond to it. Let's take the projection of the voice example from Jockin. if you go into a room and say, hey guys, I'm going to show you how I can project my voice, there's something egotistical about it. Like you're trying to show off. You want people to acknowledge a capacity you have. And then, of course, there's the question of, did you gain the capacity for its own sake or because you want to show it off, right? Like that question arises. But if you gain that capacity and hold it in, like you hold it back, unless you encounter a surprise where the capacity is needed, it is possible you've reconciled yourself to the possibility that you are learning the capacity for its own sake. You may never use it. And so you have to value it even if you're never acknowledged it, right? And there's something very important about valuing something without any external guarantees. One thinks of what I'll talk about with Nietzsche, the beastocentrism critique, and how we have to do things that we see as valuable for their own sake. Well, if you learn a capacity or an ability or wisdom or discernment or speed, I could go on, and yet there is no guarantee that you'll ever use it. That in of itself might be, that's a way to think about what it means to do something for its own sake, because there are no guarantees. You may never use it, unless the error occurs by which you could use it and it not be egotistical, because you're showing it for the addressing of the error, not to be acknowledged. And so with capacity that you commit to only using for the sake of dealing with surprise and error or stuff like that, or when you're called onto the stage, or when, someone needs somebody to tell the kids a story or to dance, or I could go on. Well, one, there's a humility there. Two, there's a risk there. You're putting all your time into a capacity you may never use. Three, there is something about how that would habituate and work the psyche. Because you have to face, there's something sacrificial. You have to face the reality that you may be doing this for nothing. And I think that requires courage and fear. So I think there's a lot that goes into the subject that would gain a capacity without any guarantee to do it. And it's also non-rational, which is an important theme throughout O.G. Rose. Because why would you learn a capacity you have no guarantee of using? That's not rational. It's not practical. And yet, there's something powerful about it. But let's say you gain these capacities, like projecting your voice. Then when the surprise occurs and you're forced to present in a bar, then there's a grace to it. And you can finally let be this capacity you've had and it not be egotistical. It not be an expression of a being, yourself, but being in a Heideggerian sense, this thing coming forth, this grace that you're letting be. And I think Thomas Wynne does such an excellent job speaking about letting be and the grace of letting be. And I think we can make sense of that when we think about the very practical circumstance of the error, the surprise. I was thinking recently on, there's a lot of emphasis today, and I mentioned, Michelle and I talked about it at the O.G. Rose talk on responsibility, but there's a lot of talk today on pragmatism, getting back to the body, getting back to common life, as we'll talk about with Hume. But it's interesting to think of, there's a difference between getting back to using your hands and doing something that's practical and getting back to the breaks, like the real and the con, the surprise. And I think getting back to the body is great, but by that, I think thinking about getting back to the place of possible surprise, that's a different matter. And in fact, you could be very practical, quote unquote, getting back to the body, but define practical as the removal of error, and now you run the risk of replacing humanity with technology and systems and protocols, not extending humanity, which we learn in Ivan Illich is a big mistake, and that's a perpetual tension we talk about. So, it's really important to think about the surprise, and the surprise, the error, the mistake is where you can let be capacity and not be egotistical. And in that, you also see virtue independent of utility. Utilitarianism, because you can never, have a utilitarian calculus for something you don't know is going to occur, that you may never use, and you may never use it. So there's a virtue, there's a valuation, there's a valuing that is occurring there that transcends an easy calculus. And in being able to rise to the circumstance, to meet it, to address it, there is something noble, there's something good, and then critically beautiful about it. And the critical thing about the beauty is it's not necessarily repeatable. And you're also encountering a certain limit, there is no technology. The limit here is that you've got to work within not having the audio technology, right? And what Ebert would say is at the limit, in the encounter with the limit, there's the possibility of the limitless occurring. Well, likewise, in this, the other thing Ebert has spoken about is how beauty has a certain transience to it, a certain evanescence. It's not repeatable, and therefore it keeps the aura that Walter Benjamin talks about. Well, in this circumstance of Jacquin's example, you can't repeat that. You can't will that. Like an error, by definition, cannot be willed. So it has a fundamental transience. That's part of it. A fundamental lack of repeatability that occurs. And in it, that's why, if you can rise to its occasion, there's a particular beauty of it. The other thing, too, with it, there's a lot of talk today about the certification problem, the authority problem, the legitimization problem that Habermas talks about, the collapse of institutions. What's also very interesting is you can't really fake a surprise. You can't cheat a surprise. Like there's, Jacquin was mentioning how live speech for Aristotle is uniquely powerful for showing a person's capacity. Well, likewise, your ability to respond to a surprise is uniquely powerful in showing one's capacity. And so what you could also see in the surprise and the improvisation and the meeting, the encounterology, there's a unique kind of certification, a unique kind of authority that comes from that. That is very hard to cheat, very hard to fake, right? Ivan Illich talked a lot about the dangers of certification, and there's a legitimization crisis, like Habermas says. Well, the surprise is an environment in which you really can see capability, and it's very hard to fake it. I'm not sure if I'm ready to say it's impossible, but it does seem pretty impossible if it's a genuine error. And then we also mentioned at the net how the liminal web might provide avenues for this kind of testing, this kind of certification that helps us overcome things like the introduction problem, the legitimization problem, et cetera, so forth, the professional managerial class, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, the funny thing about that is if there are all these benefits of error and, surprise, then a finite world where unexpected things can occur and also bad things, by definition, could be, the best of all possible worlds, right? And we talked about that, where finitude thus is a gift, precisely because finitude, it also means there's always something that humans can do that AI cannot do, right? Like there's always the capacity for a response to a surprise that is not predictable, that the human can step in and really shine with something beautiful, because there's a beauty that comes forth in the surprise that cannot be replicated. And so finitude thus is a gift, because finitude allows these encounters with limits. And so we shouldn't be quick to think that finitude is bad, and that there's good reason for it. The other thing too is the encounter, the surprise, by definition has to suggest that the world exists outside your head, so that there is the otherness, that it's real. It also suggests the primacy of relationships in metaphysics versus points, as is often talked about in the liminal web. It suggests that there's a world there, that the world is actually there, because a surprise, by definition, is something you cannot think you encounter, right? What's also interesting about this is it can help us order or think, well, what's the role of rationality, efficiency, and technological thinking, right? Well, it's not to keep there from being error, to keep surprise from occurring, but once you encounter a surprise, once you go into a bar where the audio equipment doesn't work, it then becomes rational to fix it, right? You use efficiency and technological technique thinking to fix things. Because if you don't, then it's not a surprise, and it can't have all these virtuous meanings. You're gamifying error then. It's not true error, not true surprise, and thus becomes a source of great vice. So what you see here, what's very interesting, is that efficiency, if you will, virtue, surprise, and efficiency, we might say, these things all exist in a kind of relationship that keeps the absolute spirit, the Geist in a Hegelian sense, that keeps the creative process, maybe a Whitehead sense, going. The role of efficient thinking or rationality is to make sure that you're always surprised. Because whatever errors you encounter, you want to then genuinely try to fix, so that the stage is set for the possibility of a real surprise, in which virtue, beauty, self-forgetfulness, capacity can come out. And also in a surprise, in that beauty, there's a particular shine that's possible there that suggests something more to life, therefore meaning. There's talk of the meaning crisis. There's something very meaningful because there's something very beautiful, and there's something very noble about rising to the occasion of a surprise. And so efficient thinking, technology, these things exist not to avoid surprise, but to make sure that surprise is genuine, so that there is surprise. The problem is it's very difficult not to overfit and to try to avoid surprise entirely, because surprise is scary. It is the real, when things don't go according to plan. But the real, the lack that we've talked about, the dusting potentially that we've talked about, Lacan, not that these are all the same, that is precisely where negentropic potential is possible. But it's based on if we are children and able to rise to its occasion. So, again, the efficiency exists to make sure that error is genuine when it is encountered, so that surprise is genuine when it is encountered, which is an opportunity for capacity to show without showing off. Therefore, you can let it be, thus the grace of error, but then one uses rationality to remove that error so that next time you're genuinely surprised. And so that other people can be genuinely surprised. And, I've spoken with Goodell about the idea that really the future is not so much what AI will do, but what AI won't do that we won't know it can't do, and then we'll have to rise to its occasion. Well, that's inevitable. Some unexpected thing is going to occur, and the question is going to be, will we be ready for it or not? And if today we can start to see that unexpected thing as an error that will give us an opportunity to let be and show capacity and virtue and beauty and meaning and dance in a kind of Nietzschean sense, then this is not something we need to fear, but something we need to prepare for so that it would be beautiful indeed. But that work has to start now, because the question of how we respond to tomorrow is not something we can plan, only something that we're prepared for, and you have to prepare today for what might happen tomorrow, so that tomorrow could be a sign of grace, not a sign of self-effacement. For more by O.G. Rose, please see ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, so on and so forth, and please check out Net 111, where we elaborate on these topics. And thank you so much for your time.